She texts me every night at 7, like clockwork. Dinner's ready, are you coming home? She never gives up.
She's still trying to save our marriage.
My husband laughed the night he told his men I was still trying to save our marriage. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I had come back through the private hallway of the Windward Gala to find a quiet corner and catch my breath, and instead I found his voice, low and easy, coming from behind a half-closed door. I knew that voice. It was the one he used when he thought no one who mattered was listening. She texts me every night at 7, he was saying. Like clockwork. Dinner's ready. Are you coming home? She never gives up. Someone laughed. Titus, I think. And then my husband, Joon-tae, the man I had shared a bed with for 6 years, said the words that would end everything and begin everything at the same time. She's still trying to save our marriage. A pause. Then, quieter, almost fond. I stopped a while ago. She just doesn't know it yet. The men laughed again. Not cruelly, just easily. The way men laugh at something they find mildly amusing and completely unremarkable. He said it like weather, like a fact so old it had stopped being able to hurt anyone. He had no idea I was standing 3 feet away in a hallway full of candlelight, in the dress I'd chosen because he once said he liked me in blue, holding a clutch that still had my 7 o'clock reminder typed and ready to send. The same message I'd sent him almost every night for 6 years. If you've ever given everything you had to something that quietly stopped needing you, stay with me, because I need you to hear what I did next. Hit subscribe now, because where this goes next, you are not going to want to miss it. I want to tell you who I was before that hallway, because I think it matters. My name is Zora Renshaw, and for 6 years I had been the wife of a man who ran an empire most people in this city knew enough to fear and not enough to understand. Joon-tae never called it what it was. He called it the business, or the operation, the way other men might call a bakery. But I had learned, the way wives in certain marriages learn things they are never told directly, exactly what kind of certainty moved through every room he entered. Doors opened for him before he reached them. Men who negotiated for a living went quiet when he spoke. He did not raise his voice, because he had never needed to. He simply expected the world to arrange itself around his preference. And for 6 years, it mostly had. I had been part of that arranging. I knew which of his lieutenants needed to be greeted by name and which ones found it intrusive. I knew that Titus Marchbanks, who had worked beside Joon-tae for over a decade, always wanted his glass refilled before he thought to ask. And I knew that the attorney they kept on retainer hated being seated near windows because he was, in his own careful way, always watching the street. Nobody taught me any of this. I paid attention quietly, the way you learn a language nobody bothers translating for you. I remember one dinner early in our marriage when a supplier from the West Coast came in tense and defensive, certain he was about to be replaced. I spent 40 minutes before the meal talking to him about nothing. His daughter's soccer season. A restaurant he liked. Anything that would soften him enough to walk into that dining room and actually hear what Joon-tae was offering instead of what he was afraid of losing. Joon-tae never knew that conversation happened. He just knew the deal closed clean. He called it a good night and went to bed satisfied without ever asking why the room had felt easier than he expected. I met him at a fundraiser I wasn't even supposed to be at. I was filling in for a friend who'd gotten sick, wearing a borrowed dress and carrying a clipboard that wasn't mine. He crossed a room full of people who all wanted something from him to ask me, of all people, whether the wine was actually any good. He'd been watching me not drink it all night. I told him the truth. It was mediocre, and everyone was too polite to say so. He laughed like it surprised him, and for a long time afterward, I mistook that laugh for the beginning of something rare. He called it certainty when he talked about why he'd chosen me so fast. I called it being seen. I didn't understand yet that those could be two very different things wearing the same face. For the first 2 years, I found all of it magnetic. Joon-tae did not waver. He did not hedge, apologize, or second-guess a decision once it was made. And there had been a version of me who believed that same unshakable certainty extended to how he felt about me. that I was one of the things he had decided about permanently. I understand now that I had been wrong about that, and that I had known I was wrong for longer than I wanted to admit. I told myself every marriage went through quiet stretches. I told myself busy was not the same thing as gone. So I kept doing what I had always done. I ran our household with a kind of precision nobody thought to call a skill. I organized the Windward Foundation Gala, which had grown year over year into one of the more visible charity nights in the city. Months of guest lists, seating charts, and donor calls that had to look effortless by the time the candles were lit. I sent the 7 o'clock texts. I remembered the names of people he mentioned once in passing and asked about them weeks later. That always seemed to faintly surprise him, though never enough that he wondered why I bothered. I bothered because I was still trying. That is the simplest way I know how to say it. I had spent 3 weeks on that gala. The venue, the seating, the silent auction, the lighting, the delicate math of which of Joon-tae's associates could not be seated near which others. All of it had passed through my hands. The night itself was going well. The auction exceeded its target. Several of his key people made a point of finding him in the room, which meant the evening had done the thing it was actually designed to do beneath the charity and the string quartet. I smoothed over a catering delay nobody at the head table noticed. I redirected a conversation drifting somewhere it shouldn't. I did all of it in heels that were slowly killing me, and a smile I had practiced enough times that it no longer felt like effort. Around 9, I slipped away to find a quieter corridor. One of the private reception rooms I'd booked as overflow space for his inner circle. And that was where I heard my husband tell his men that I hadn't figured out yet that he was already gone. I remember the exact texture of the wallpaper under my hand when I stopped walking. My first thought, absurdly, was that I should go check on the auction closing, because some part of me was still doing the job while the rest of me came apart 3 feet from a closed door. That was when I understood how deep the habit went. I was losing my marriage in real time and still trying to make sure nobody else noticed. I stayed in the ballroom another 2 hours after that, and nobody, not one donor, waiter, board member, or man who had laughed behind that door, knew my marriage had changed. That mattered to me. If Joon-tae was going to discover what his carelessness had cost him, he would discover it through absence, not a scene. I did not open that door. I want to be honest about why, because it would be easy to make it sound braver than it was. It was not bravery. Something in me had gone very still. The way water goes still right before it freezes. Not broken. Just suddenly, completely quiet. I understood, standing in that hallway, that I was not going to walk in and demand an explanation. I was not going to give him the chance to soften it, apologize for it, or construct some version of the evening where both of us could pretend the words had meant something gentler than what they meant. I turned around instead. I fixed my face. I walked back into the lights and finished hosting the gala. My husband's mistake was funding, and I smiled for every photograph, including the one a board member wanted of the two of us together. Composed and golden. The picture of a marriage that had built something meaningful. Joon-tae put his hand on my back for that photo, the way he always did in public. I did not flinch. I did not let a single thing show. On the drive home, he told me the evening had gone well. I agreed. He mentioned a donor who had pledged more than expected. I said that was good news. We had a short, ordinary conversation, the kind we'd had 100 times before. And I remember being almost impressed by how normal my voice sounded. I joked about the string quartet running long. He laughed easily. The same laugh I'd heard through that door, and I knew I would probably never hear it again without hearing the hallway too. When we got home, he fell asleep with the ease of a man who had no idea anything had changed. I lay awake beside him and made a decision that had nothing to do with punishing him. I was not going to confront him. I was not going to send another 7 o'clock text asking if he was coming home. I was going to stop arranging my entire life around the possibility that he might eventually notice it. I had spent 6 years being the only one still trying. I had not fully understood, until that hallway, how long I had actually been trying alone. The most important part of the decision, the part I held on to while he slept beside me, was this. He would not know. I was not going to tell him what I'd heard. He was simply going to find, over the days and weeks that followed, that something in our house had quietly rearranged itself, and he was going to have no way of knowing what, or when, or why. He had told his men I hadn't figured it out yet. I had figured it out standing 3 feet from a closed door while he laughed easily in a room I wasn't supposed to be near. The difference was, he wasn't going to be the one who got to decide when I told him that. Joon-tae had spent 15 years making certain he always knew more than the person across from him. He built an entire empire on that advantage. He had no idea, falling asleep that night, that his wife had just quietly taken it from him. I did not make a scene. I did not pack a bag or leave a note on the counter. I did not sit him down for a conversation that would force him to perform remorse he hadn't earned yet. What I did was far quieter than any of that, and far more effective, because it targeted the exact things he had never learned to notice, precisely because they had always simply been there. If he came home past 9, he found the kitchen clean and the food put away. No covered plate waiting in the oven. No text asking what time to expect him. If he walked into a room where I was reading, I didn't look up the way I used to. That automatic, almost reflexive redirect of attention I had given him for years without ever realizing it was a gift. I kept reading. If he didn't ask about my day, I didn't offer it. The conversation that had, for years, been kept alive almost entirely by my own effort simply stopped happening. And the silence that replaced it wasn't hostile. It was just quiet, which was somehow worse for him than an argument would have been. There was a Tuesday, about 2 weeks in, when he came home at 10 and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Waiting, I think, for me to ask where he'd been. I didn't. I was at the table with a book. I said good evening, the way you'd say it to a neighbour, and went back to my page. He made himself a plate from what was left in the fridge, standing at the counter to eat it because there was no place set for him anymore. I heard him rinse the dish afterward and set it in the rack with a kind of careful quiet, like he was trying not to disturb something. A few nights later, he tried leaving his own note on the counter. Something small. He'd be late. I shouldn't wait up. I read it and didn't respond, because I had already stopped waiting up weeks before he thought to tell me not to. I think that was the first time he understood the silence wasn't going to answer him, just because he'd finally started speaking into it. He noticed something was different before he could name it. It arrived as a low, formless unease. The sense that something familiar had been rearranged without his permission. He couldn't point to anything. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't openly distant. I had simply developed a center of gravity that no longer orbited him. Then it followed him to work. He started making small mistakes at the office. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that Titus pulled him aside after a meeting and told him whatever was happening at home needed to stay there. Joon-tae said everything was fine. Titus gave him the look of a man who knew better and let the lie sit between them. A few days later, Joon-tae stumbled twice over numbers during dinner with 2 longtime partners, figures he normally would have recited without notes. One of the men actually stopped and asked if he was feeling all right. He recovered. The deal still closed, but afterward, he sat alone in the car longer than necessary, disturbed by something larger than the mistakes themselves. For 15 years, he had been the man other people worried about disappointing. Now, something he couldn't name inside his own house had followed him into a room where he could not afford to lose his footing. Titus told me later that he'd warned him more plainly in private. In 15 years, he'd never seen Joon-tae distracted by anything outside the business. Whatever was happening at home, Titus said, had better be faced before it cost him something he couldn't buy back. Joon-tae didn't answer. Apparently, he looked like a man who already suspected that was exactly what was happening. I had found something I hadn't gone looking for. I stopped in front of a small storefront one afternoon in late October. Not because I'd planned to. Because the hand-painted sign in the window caught my eye and I had nowhere in particular to be. It was the Bellhaven Youth Literacy Centre. 2 rooms above a shuttered print shop, run mostly on grant money and stubbornness by a woman named Charmaine Lowe. Inside, I learned they ran weekend reading sessions for kids whose schools had cut library funding years ago and never gotten it back. Charmaine said they were always short on hands. I told her I'd come back Saturday. I did. And then the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Within a month, I was organising activity sessions, sitting cross-legged on donated carpet with 7-year-olds sounding out words, doing the unglamorous administrative work that keeps a small programme alive. There was a girl named Priya who came every week and refused to read out loud until her third Saturday. And when she finally did, stumbling through a whole page without stopping, the whole room stopped what it was doing to clap for her. I cried a little in the supply closet afterward where nobody could see. Nobody at Belhaven knew who my husband was. Nobody cared. I was just the woman who showed up early and stayed late and remembered which kids liked the blue chairs and which ones needed the quiet corner. Charmaine noticed the change in me before anyone else did, before even I would have named it. She told me once, months later, that the woman who'd wandered in off the street that October afternoon had looked like someone holding her breath, and that somewhere around the second or third Saturday, she'd started to look like someone who'd finally exhaled. Charmaine didn't ask questions. She just kept handing me more responsibility. A key to the supply closet. Then a say in which books got ordered. Then, eventually, an actual say in how the whole reading program was run. And I took every bit of it. Because for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone was handing me things because they trusted my judgment. Not because it made their life easier. Joon-tae found out I'd been doing it for over a month when he checked the calendar on my phone, looking for a date he thought I'd mentioned. He saw my Saturdays accounted for in a way he'd never registered before. He asked me about it that evening. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out sharper than he probably intended. I looked at him for a second. The way you look at something while deciding how much of your attention it deserves. You never asked. I went back to what I was doing. It wasn't a confrontation. I said it without any edge at all. A plain, observable fact. He couldn't find a way to argue with it because it was true. He had not asked. Not once. In all the months, my Saturdays had quietly disappeared from his calendar and reappeared on mine. The turning point for him came on a grey Tuesday in early December when a storm shut half the city down and he cancelled an important meeting. Instead of working from home, he drove across town to Belhaven. He told himself later that he'd simply been nearby. He had not been nearby. Through the front windows, he could see me near the back, helping two boys carry a box of donated books. I bent down to say something that made one of them laugh so hard he nearly dropped his end. I straightened and looked around that cramped, warm, slightly chaotic room the way a person looks at somewhere she actually wants to be. He stood outside longer than he meant to. He had watched me smile at hundreds of galas, donor dinners, and formal events beside him. He had always assumed I was simply good at that life. Watching me through the glass, he understood for the first time that what he'd seen in those rooms had been a performance. Not fake, but practiced, useful. Expected. This wasn't. There was no audience at Belhaven, no one important to impress, no outcome tied to his name. Just children who needed help and a woman who kept showing up because she wanted to. He went inside. For 2 hours, he assembled a bookshelf that had sat unopened for weeks and helped a 7-year-old sound out words from a picture book about a dog who wanted to be an astronaut. He wasn't especially good at either job. Nobody cared who he was outside those walls. He drove home quieter than he'd arrived. A few days later, he was in the study we technically shared looking for a folder when he found my journal open on the desk. He had not gone searching for it. His eyes landed on one line before he thought to look away. Loving someone shouldn't require disappearing piece by piece. He told me later that he stood there for a long time. He did not turn the page. He read only what was already open. Evenings I'd waited past 9 and eaten alone. Conversations he'd half participated in. Small attempts I'd made toward him that had found nothing to hold on to. None of it read like accusation. It read like someone recording the weather because she needed the truth somewhere outside herself. Until then, Joon-tae had been telling himself I was going through a phase. Something that would resolve if he waited long enough. That open page ended the story completely. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't seeing someone else. I was finding out who I was when my entire life wasn't organized around him. What he still couldn't prove was whether all of it had started at the gala. He suspected it had. He just wasn't ready to ask. He didn't get much longer to sit with it, because that was around the time Damon Castellano decided he wanted a piece of what my husband had spent 15 years building. Castellano controlled part of the docks on the east side of the city. He was not at Joon-tae's level, but he was patient. And patient men can become dangerous when they know where to press. For months, he had been collecting enough information to make trouble if he ever decided to hand it to the wrong people. Joon-tae knew about the pressure and treated it the way he treated most threats. Quietly, several steps ahead, with Titus handling the details while he decided how much attention the problem deserved. Then a photograph arrived on his phone. It was me outside Belhaven, taken from across the street. I was carrying a box of books with Priya walking beside me, both of us laughing at something the camera couldn't hear. The timestamp was 3 weeks old. Underneath it was one sentence that made the point without needing to say anything uglier. Saturdays seem important to her. Joon-tae stared at the picture long enough for Titus to ask if he was still on the line. He made this personal, Joon-tae said. The old version of my husband might have solved the problem by surrounding Belhaven with men. Changing my route, deciding I was no longer allowed to go somewhere because danger had touched it. He later admitted the instinct crossed his mind. Then he pictured himself, telling me that the first place I'd found that belonged entirely to me was now another thing his life had taken away. So he didn't call me. He didn't send guards to the literacy center. He didn't turn my Saturday into his operation. He went to Castellano. The warehouse near the docks was mostly dark when Joon-tae walked in with Titus beside him. Castellano had expected a negotiation by phone. Instead, he found Joon-tae standing 10 feet away, coat still wet from the rain, looking at him with the kind of calm that meant the conversation had already become much shorter than Castellano planned. Castellano started talking about territory. Joon-tae placed the photograph of me on the table between them. Everything connected to her disappears tonight. That was all. Castellano tried to smile. He asked what made one woman at a children's reading program worth changing the terms of a negotiation. Joon-tae did not answer the question. He simply waited. There was a file. There was a backup. There were people Castellano had trusted with things he should not have trusted them with. By the end of the night, every copy Joon-tae could verify was gone. The pressure on the docks had been settled. And Castellano understood one boundary more clearly than he understood any piece of territory. My name did not belong in his mouth again. Joon-tae could have taken more from him. He didn't. He had come for one problem and removed one problem. Then he left. On the drive home, with the warehouse behind him, he expected the satisfaction he usually felt when a threat had been handled cleanly. It never came. What came instead was a realization he couldn't negotiate his way around. He could make dangerous men erase photographs. He could close a door on a threat before I ever knew it had opened. He could protect my schedule, my route, my safety, the physical borders of my life. He could not make me want him inside that life. For 15 years, power had taught him that if something mattered enough, there was always a lever. Money, fear, loyalty, pressure, information. Some mechanism that could move the thing in front of him. There was no lever for this. The woman in that photograph was smiling in a place he had not given her, doing work he had not arranged, surrounded by people who did not need his approval to value her. And the most frightening part, he told me later, was not that Castellano had found me. It was that Joon-tae finally understood I had found myself. He came downstairs early one January morning before I was awake, made coffee, stood in the kitchen of a house that hadn't started moving yet, and understood that he had finally run out of reasons to wait. When I came down and found him there, something in the way he was standing told me this wasn't going to be one of the ordinary mornings we'd been sharing for weeks. So I didn't cross to the other side of the kitchen the way I'd gotten into the habit of doing. I stayed by the doorway and looked at him. He said he needed to talk to me. He didn't reach for strategy. He didn't try to manage how I'd take it. He simply told me what had happened at the gala. His exact words. The way the room had laughed, the ease with which he'd said it, like the state of our marriage was a mildly amusing piece of information to share over a drink. He told me all of it plainly, without softening the parts that made him look worst, because softening them, he said, would have been one more way of managing me. And he was finished doing that. When he was done, he looked at me and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him for months. "You heard, didn't you?" He said it slowly. The way you say something you've rehearsed so many times, it no longer feels like your own voice. The Windward Gala, the room with Titus and the others. You heard what I said about the texts, about you still trying. Here's where I want you to comment the one word that best describes what you'd have done in that hallway, because I think you're going to feel this next part. I was quiet for a long moment. The morning light came through the window at that low winter angle. The coffee was going cold on the counter between us. Then I said it. I heard everything. I watched it land in his face the way weather changes on open water. No single visible moment. Just an entire surface shifting at once. He'd clearly prepared himself, in some abstract way, for the possibility that this was true. Hearing me actually say it was different from preparing for it, I watched him understand, in the space after those 3 words, the entire architecture of the last months. Every Saturday at Belhaven. Every night I hadn't waited up. Every conversation I hadn't started. Every moment I'd seemed quietly, completely fine without him in the room. All of it had begun in that hallway. I had known since the morning after the gala. I had known every single day since. And I hadn't said a word. Because I had already decided that whether he knew or not was no longer the most important question in my own life. He told me he was sorry. He said it without qualification. Without the explanations and mitigating context, people usually wrap around an apology to make it easier to give. He said he was sorry. He meant it. And he left it there. I was quiet for a moment before I answered. What surprised him wasn't what I said. It was how steady I was saying it. I told him the part that had hurt the most wasn't actually the words themselves. Some part of me had already known, quietly, for longer than I wanted to admit. I had simply been doing the work of not knowing, because the alternative was harder to face. Hearing him say it plainly hadn't broken something that had been intact. It had confirmed what I'd already been managing not to see. And in doing that, it had finally made the not seeing impossible. He asked me, quietly, why I hadn't just told him that night. Or the next morning. Or any of the dozens of mornings after that. I told him I'd thought about it more than once. But every time I imagined saying it out loud, I could already see how it would go. Him apologizing too fast. Both of us agreeing to move past it before either of us had actually looked at it. And 6 months later, we'd be exactly where we started. Except now I would have handed him the choice of when to fix it instead of making it mine. I wasn't interested in giving him that back. I wanted to know, for myself, whether I could stand on my own before I decided whether I wanted to stand next to him. I told him something else too. Something that cost me more to say because it meant admitting my own part in how we'd gotten there. I told him I had made myself into a supporting feature of his life. Willingly. And I wasn't blaming him for that piece of it. I had confused the work of holding everything together with love. I had believed that if I kept making everything easy for him, the act of doing it would eventually mean what I needed it to mean. I understood now that it hadn't worked that way. It had only meant that I disappeared gradually, without anyone noticing, including me. He didn't try to tell me I was wrong. He listened to all of it with the stillness of a man receiving something he knew he'd earned. When I finished, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for something smaller, and I think more honest. He asked to be allowed to stay close enough, long enough, to prove that the man who'd spoken so easily about giving up wasn't the only version of him that existed. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I told him I was going to Belhaven on Saturday. He could come if he wanted to. That was all I offered him. He understood it was all he had the right to receive. He came Saturday. He came the Saturday after that, and the one after that. He kept coming without being asked twice. He didn't bring anyone with him. He didn't write a check and put his name on a plaque. He showed up the way every other volunteer showed up. Early. Ready to do whatever needed doing. Without expecting the work to reflect well on him anywhere. He carried boxes. He assembled furniture. He sat across from kids who had no idea who he was outside those walls and listened to them read, correcting them gently. With more patience than I'd ever seen him apply to anything in 6 years of marriage. It wasn't a performance. He wasn't doing it so I'd notice. Though I did notice. And I didn't say anything about it either. He started coming home for dinner as a real choice instead of whenever his schedule happened to release him. He put his phone face down on the table. The first few times, I could see the habit fighting him. His hand drifting toward it before he caught himself. When I talked about Belhaven, he let me finish. He asked questions that proved he'd listened. Once, after I mentioned that Priya had finished her first whole book, he remembered her name the following week without being prompted. It was tiny. It mattered. He did not become a different man overnight. One evening in March, he came home late without calling, distracted by something at the office, then reached for his phone twice during dinner. I said nothing. I didn't need to. He looked at my face, put the phone in the other room, came back, and asked me to start my sentence again because he knew he hadn't heard the first half. Another time, he tried to rearrange one of my Saturday commitments after assuming I would attend a dinner with him. I told him I already had plans. For a second, irritation flashed across his face, the old expectation that my calendar would move around his. Then he caught it. "You're right," he said. "I should have asked." That was the difference I kept noticing. He still got things wrong, but he no longer disappeared behind authority when he did. He stayed in the room. He corrected himself. He tried again. 3 weeks after that first Saturday together, I gave him the clearest proof that showing up did not mean he had won anything back. He came into the study one evening and found a cream-colored envelope beside my laptop. He knew the attorney's name printed in the corner. I watched recognition move through his face before he looked at me. "What is that? I could have hidden it. I didn't." "Separation papers." He went completely still. I told him I had asked for them weeks before our kitchen conversation, before he admitted what he'd said at the gala. Back when I was still deciding whether learning to live without him also meant I needed to leave him. The papers had been finished for almost a month. I had not signed them. I had not thrown them away either. For a second, I saw the old Joon-tae arrive in his face, the man who solved uncertainty by taking control of it. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth like he was about to ask what the lawyer had told me, what the terms were, what exactly I intended to do. Then he stopped. He sat down across from me instead. "Do you want me to leave tonight?" It was not the question I expected. "No." He nodded once. "Do you want me to ask you not to sign them?" I looked at him. "Would it change anything if you did?" His eyes dropped to the envelope. "No." That answer hurt him. I could see that it did, but he said it anyway. I told him I didn't know what I was going to do. I needed him to understand that the Saturdays, the dinners, the fact that I was speaking to him again, none of it was a promise. I was watching who he became when there was no guarantee I would reward him for becoming better. He took that in quietly. Then he said, "You spent a long time doing the work because you were afraid I'd leave. I'm not going to make you do the work because I'm afraid you will." He stood, left the envelope where it was, and went downstairs. I cried after he left the room. Not because he'd finally said the perfect thing. It wasn't perfect. Part of me had wanted him to fight harder, to grab the papers, to tell me there was no version of his future that allowed me to leave. Another part of me knew that would have been the same old man wearing desperation instead of certainty. The envelope stayed on my desk. So did the choice. The next morning, the envelope was where I'd left it. Joon-tae came into the kitchen, poured coffee, and did not look toward the study. I almost wanted him to. Some old part of me still expected love to announce itself through panic. Instead, he asked whether Belhaven still needed someone to fix the broken cabinet door. I said yes. He nodded, wrote it down, and left for work. It was harder to distrust patience than desperation. Desperation performs. Patience has to return tomorrow. In late February, Belhaven's landlord announced that the lease would not be renewed on the old terms. The new number was high enough that Charmaine read the email twice before she handed me her phone. If nothing changed, the centre would have to close before summer. I told Joon-tae over dinner. His answer came so quickly it almost made me laugh. "I'll cover it." I put my fork down. He saw my face and stopped. "What? That's exactly what you always do." His shoulders shifted. "Keep things from falling apart? Decide what the solution is before anybody else finishes speaking." The room went quiet. 6 months earlier, he would have defended himself. 3 months earlier, he might have explained that he was only trying to help. This time, he sat with the correction long enough for it to be uncomfortable. Then he asked, "What does Charmaine think she needs?" "I don't know." Then I should probably ask Charmaine. That was how he ended up at Belhaven 2 mornings later, sitting at a scratched folding table while Charmaine walked him through the lease. The grants they'd lost, the grants still pending, and the number that kept the lights on every month. He did not interrupt her once. Halfway through, he reached for a legal pad and began writing. Charmaine stopped talking. "What are you doing?" Trying to understand it. "Good," she said. Because if you offer to buy the building before I finish, I'm going to ask Zora to make you leave. I covered my mouth. Joon-tae looked at me, then back at Charmaine. I was going to offer to buy the building. I know. For the first time that morning, he laughed. Then he put the pen down and listened. The eventual solution was not a donation with his name attached to it. It was a long-term arrangement negotiated with the owner, a new non-profit structure that protected Belhaven from another sudden rent jump, and 2 funding introductions Charmaine could accept or reject herself. Joon-tae used his reach, but he did not use it to become the center of the story. A week later, Charmaine texted me 3 words and an exclamation point. "We're safe!" I showed him the message while he was washing 2 coffee cups at the sink. He read it, smiled once, handed my phone back. He didn't ask whether she'd thanked him. He didn't ask whether I was impressed. He just said, "Good." That small word mattered because I knew how badly the old version of him would have wanted credit for the rescue. This version seemed to understand that if Belhaven survived, the point was that Belhaven survived. On an afternoon in early spring, when the trees near our building were just starting to open, we walked home from Belhaven without talking about anything important. After a few blocks, Joon-tae said the thing he was most ashamed of wasn't what he'd said at the gala. It was how easily he'd said it. Not in anger. Not exhausted. Not drunk enough to pretend he hadn't meant it. He had said it lightly, with the mild amusement of a man for whom the truth had become so old he could hand it out like weather. That ease, he said, frightened him more than the sentence itself, because it showed him who he had quietly become. I walked beside him before answering. I wasn't the only one trying after that night, I said. He looked at me. I stopped trying that night. He absorbed the correction. Then I told him what mattered. Before the gala, I had fought for our marriage because I was afraid of what stopping would mean. I had organized myself around the fear of losing something I wasn't even sure I still wanted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had learned that my Saturdays could be full without him, that I could matter in rooms his name had never opened, that I could build a life whose shape did not depend on whether Lee Joon-tae came home for dinner. So if I'm still walking beside you, I said, don't confuse that with me needing to. He didn't. I told him the man who showed up at Belhaven, came home for dinner, listened when it was inconvenient, and corrected himself when he slipped. That was a man I could choose. Could. Not had to. There was a difference now, and both of us knew it. He didn't answer right away. We walked another half-block in that early spring light before he said he understood the difference between being chosen and being defaulted to, and that he intended to keep trying to be worth the first one, even if the envelope on my desk eventually told him he had been too late. He didn't ask what I planned to do with the papers. I noticed that too. I didn't promise him anything in return. I just kept walking beside him. The separation papers stayed in the study drawer where I had put them, neither signed nor destroyed, because I was finished making symbolic decisions just to make somebody else feel secure. Somewhere in the middle of that ordinary block, the story of our marriage became something different from what it had been. Not fixed, not erased, not guaranteed, just different. Because for the first time, both of us understood that staying was not the absence of leaving. Staying was a decision that had to remain alive. By early summer, a volunteer at Belhaven asked me if Joon-tae would be back the following week. I told her yes. He always comes back now. That evening, walking home, I told him what I'd said. He reached for my hand. I let him take it. I'll always come back, he told me. I looked at him. Don't promise always. His hand loosened slightly, like he thought I was about to pull mine away. Promise Saturday. For a second, he just stared at me. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Saturday, he said. That was enough. Not forever. Not forgiveness stamped and completed. Not a marriage magically returned to what it had been before the hallway. Saturday. One choice close enough to prove. I still think about that hallway sometimes. The candlelight. The wallpaper under my hand. The sound of men laughing at something true because none of them believed the truth would cost anything. I don't think about it as the night my marriage ended. I think about it as the night I stopped doing all the work required to keep a dead version of it alive. For 6 years, I thought love meant making myself useful enough to be impossible to lose. I remembered every detail, softened every room, sent every text, kept every plate warm, and called the exhaustion devotion because admitting I was lonely would have required me to change something. Then I heard my husband laugh, and I stopped. My husband once told a room full of his men that his wife was the only one still trying. He was right in that moment. What he had no way of knowing, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the second I stopped, he would finally start. If this story reached you, it is because someone else liked, commented, or subscribed and helped it travel. Do the same so it can reach someone who needs to hear this tonight. And tell me this. If you had been standing in that hallway, would you have confronted him immediately? Or would you have gone quiet and let him discover what your effort had been worth?